It was around 1964, and shortly thereafter, that a campus minister in Gainesville, Florida, started at the Crossroads Church of Christ a discipling ministry that would impact the history of churches of Christ. In fact, it would get to the point where Time magazine would do a huge article on a segment of the churches of Christ that had kind of broken away called the International Churches of Christ, and many called it the discipling movement. Still today, there are international churches of Christ in virtually every major city here in the United States, although the International Church of Christ went through some major challenges. If you know anything about the discipling movement, you know that it was a highly evangelistic movement and is still a highly evangelistic movement. And yet there are challenges and things to learn from. Nick Zola is a professor here at Pepperdine University. He would want me to say he is an associate professor here, so I want to be careful about the proper academic language that I use. Nick is also a good friend and somebody who stands in all three streams of the restoration movement. Nick, you have taught at a independent Christian church school, and you have taught at a Church of Christ school, and I know that you are continuing to be involved in the ICOC. So tell me, Nick, how long have you been at Pepperdine now?
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks, James, for that tremendous amount of resources that you shared with us. That was really special, and I appreciate very much what you have outlined for us. This is my 5th year at Pepperdine. This is it feels like 5 years in the last year, but it's technically my fifth year.
And where were you teaching before you came here?
I taught for 3 years at Lincoln Christian University, which, as you mentioned, is a sister school that's part of the independent Christian church side of the Stone Campbell Restoration Movement.
So what was your introduction to the International Churches of Christ? What was your connection there?
You know, I grew up unchurched. I grew up in San Diego, not far from where I am now, right? Southern California. No one else in my family, we talked about words for Christians, right? So I can use any of these words. No one else in my family is a believer or a disciple or a Christian or would claim any of those words at all. And I was invited to church as a teenager in high school by a couple that was leading a campus ministry as part of an International Church of Christ in San Diego, the San Diego Church of Christ. And they studied the Bible with me. So I came from almost zero Christian background. I'd been to church once or twice as a child, if I slept over with my friend's house on a Saturday night or something like that. But I had practically zero experience. And so my first introduction to Christianity was through the International Churches of Christ. They studied the Bible with me over a series of several months. And then from there, I was baptized as a sophomore in high school in San Diego.
Wow. So from standing in the quote mainline or mainstream churches of Christ, sometimes called the acapella churches, although more of them are also both and now, and then the independent Christian churches, and then the ICOC, the International Churches of Christ. Man, you've got a pretty interesting and unique view from all three of those streams. How has that impacted your thinking about the kingdom?
Yeah, considerably so. We have a running joke in my family. When we lived in Waco, Texas for a time, my first son was born there, and we sent him to a Disciples of Christ Child Development Center. So I can really claim the fourth branch to some small degree there too, although not legitimately so. Yeah, our family is the face of the restoration movement. I was baptized in the ICOC. My wife, Joy, grew up in the independent Christian churches. I've taught there and worshiped there. And then I've gone to all of these Church of Christ universities and then taught in them and worshiped there as well. It has significantly shaped me. And much of my early time, remember, I had come from zero church background, right? So much of my early time in the ICOC, this was the only kind of form of Christianity that I really knew.
Yeah.
And the narrative at the time of the ICOC, and you've mentioned kind of the swing or kind of what the ICOC itself has gone through over the last 10 or 20 years or so. The narrative at the time that I was delivered was one of pretty extreme exclusivity, right? And so that was a narrative that I bought into pretty well, not having had much experience outside anyway. And so the journey for me has really been in realizing how much bigger God is than what I ever imagined God to be, and how much wider, you might say, what it is to be a disciple means than how narrow I had kind of defined what a disciple is early on. That's been the journey for me, and that's been the result of having kind of swum through all these various streams within the Stone Campbell movement, you might say.
Yeah. Well, Nick, within the disciples, and for those who may be unfamiliar with kind of what's happened within the ICOC, Time Magazine talked about it as this huge movement. Then in 2000 and help me, 2001,
2002.
later 2002.
2002, 2003.
There was a letter that published on the internet, became known as the Henry Crete letter, written by one of the disciplers, who said, "Boy, there's just some real challenges." It was kind of is it unfair to compare it to the 99 Thesis nailed on the door in Wittenberg of challenges that, in 2 or 3 sentences, can you give somebody who doesn't know the story kind of the what happened then?
Sure, yeah. And let me just back up a second, right? But
Sure.
I will. And simply to say this, right? I would say the way to think about the ICOC is it took certain parts of the churches of Christ from which it emerged and made those the main emphasis, one of which was discipleship itself, right? And the other is evangelism, you might say. Those two kind of paired together was what the ICOC defined itself as. And that's what it became known for. That's what, the Time Magazine article, writes up about. And it becomes one of the fastest growing churches in the United States, especially in the early 90s, following suit with the Churches of Christ. Also gets highly criticized, right, from outside and within, for some of the practices that lend themselves to those extremes, right? So you're very bent on discipleship, and it can easily lend itself to ways of construing relationships that are less than healthy, right? Of kind of one over another ways of invoking what it is that Jesus calls somebody to do. You can focus on evangelism, but you can lose sight of why you do evangelism, and evangelism becomes numbers driven in some way. And so there are deep, wonderful things about what the ICOC did. I often characterize it as a renewal movement from within the Churches of Christ in some way, a renewal movement that unfortunately was not accepted by what you referred to as the mainstream in some sense, and so got pushed out to the margin and was forced to kind of do its own thing until the early 2000s or so, when even people within the movement began to critique or criticize enough, so much so that this letter from Henry Crete, who was an evangelist in London at the time, this circulates internally, and suddenly there's somebody big on the inside who's saying, we've got a lot to work on. All these kind of critiques that are coming from the outside, they're legitimate, and we need to repent. We need to make some changes. And overnight, almost in some ways, the church kind of implodes, and there's all this kind of reconciling that needs to be done, and kind of reevaluating that needs to be done. And that's what takes place over the next 10 or 20 years up until today, I would say.
Well, let me ask this, Nick. You have continued to be engaged with the international churches, and even here on campus at Pepperdine, you're engaged with a group of about 30 plus, I want to say, students who are attending here at Pepperdine, who are involved with International Churches of Christ. There's been a great deal more of openness to connections with the main line within the international churches. I even spoke at one of their teen camps here a couple summers ago, and was kind of surprised and delighted. I almost felt like, are you sure you have the right guy? So there is some openness there. But our discussion today, I really wanted you to step in and say, what have you learned from that experience that we ought to know in this time about discipleship? So let me just kind of throw that softball to you.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate you giving me this opportunity just to share a bit. The title that I kind of landed on for this was, and this is academic play on words, I suppose, to some degree. I said movements in discipleship was my main title here, right? Because oftentimes we referred to the ICOC as the movement, or as a movement, the movement of God internally, and certainly the discipling movement, as you've pointed out, right? Even externally, it was referred to that way. But movements in discipleship also for me implies ways in which I have moved in my own understanding of what discipleship is, right? So I've done my own movement in discipleship, moving in how I understand what I mean when I call myself a disciple of Jesus. And so that's what I want to present to you. That's what I want to share with you. Here's the way I've outlined this in my head and in my notes here, and I do want to not prolong this in any way. I would love to get even some interaction from the audience partway through this. I have two vignettes, so two kind of very short stories to share with you, and then two quick lessons from those two short stories. So we're doing a 2 and a 2 here. So here's vignette number 1. Vignette number 1 takes place in the year 2002. This is my first summer job, the summer after my first year of college. I've gone off to college in Boston, Massachusetts. I grew up in San Diego, but I go off to college in Boston, actually engineering, which is its own story there. So my undergraduate degree is in electrical and computer engineering, which probably doesn't surprise you considerably looking at me, but nonetheless, that's where I am. And I come back to San Diego. I get a job at a day camp, a Christian day camp, a Baptist Christian day camp, which even, in and of itself was somewhat forward thinking, I suppose, of me at the time, right? Because I'm in the ICOC there. I have joined the Boston campus ministry, which in some ways is the heart of the Boston movement. And so I've just back from a year of being in that ministry, and here I am working as a day camp counselor at this Christian day camp. And of course, I began reaching out to the other workers there because they're Baptists, right? So they need to be reached out to in some way. And I developed a reputation pretty quickly of being very serious about my Christian faith. I honestly can't remember now whether I asked for it or whether I was invited to. I'm guessing I probably asked to lead one of our staff devotionals. And so I was going to lead a staff devotional coming up. And I told them the topic ahead of time, of course. The topic is discipleship, right? Because that's what I did. That's what I knew. That's what we taught. To kind of compress the story quickly, the main pastor there gets wind of the fact that I'm a member of the International Churches of Christ. He's not part of the day camp, but he kind of oversees the day camp and talks to the director of the day camp and says, what did he ask to teach about? I bet he asked to teach about discipleship. And she said, yes, he did ask to teach about discipleship. And so he calls me into his office, and we have a very long conversation that was very difficult for me. And I'm still a teenager at this point, late teens. And it was disconcerting to have somebody predict to me all of the things that I was going to say, right? And to have somebody outline for me precisely what it was that I was about to teach. And what I realized is, I'm inside of something that I didn't know that I was inside of, in a sense. I'm part of this system that I was kind of unaware had already reached beyond me and had kind of gotten there before I did. And we had a very good conversation. It was a fruitful conversation. It's one that I think back on quite a bit, actually, in fact. So I'll stop there. That's the end of vignette number 1. Fast forward 10 years to vignette number 2. So now it's the year 2012. I am interviewing for my first teaching position. So that was my first summer job. This is my first teaching position at Lincoln Christian University, as Jeff mentioned. So this is 10 years later. And the interview is going well. It's taking place in Chicago, Illinois. They've asked me about my pedagogy and my teaching philosophy and the various degrees that I have and the research that I'm interested in and so forth. And then as we're wrapping up the interview, the very last question that the interviewer asks is, what is discipleship? What is your definition of discipleship? And I was a little taken aback because the interview hadn't exactly been about that up till that point. And so I thought for a minute, and my definition had changed considerably in the last 10 years. And so I gave kind of an updated version of what I understood discipleship to be, and I'll get to that in a moment. And it must have been enough for me to get the job, right? Because I get this job, and this is where I teach for the first 3 years of my teaching career. And Lincoln Christian was a great experience for me. I really enjoyed my time there, and I miss many of my close colleagues there. But I later come to find out. So I eventually become close to the person who interviewed me. I said, "What was that question all about?" And he says, "Well, we knew your background. We knew that you were from the ICOC, which I hadn't hidden. I had made that clear. I wanted them to know. And Lincoln Christian had a relationship with the ICOC as well. And so we wanted to know what, how much it had infiltrated you, essentially. What were you still, how did you conceive of what discipleship is?" And so I realized, oh, that was a test. That was a kind of a way of determining what I was currently thinking about how discipleship works. All right, so in between those two, that was the end of vignette number 2. Here are my 2 lessons. Here are my 2 lessons from vignettes 1 and 2. What happened in between? Well, I got a couple graduate degrees, right? That I can't deny had serious effect on the way that I understood discipleship. More than that, though, I would say I had a lot of very formative conversations, right? I met a lot of people, and I expanded my understanding of what discipleship was and who were disciples, and the way that discipleship can look different in different contexts. And then probably the biggest thing for me, honestly, is that I studied the word disciple itself. And that's what I want to draw these 2 last lessons out of for you. As part of just studying the Bible and being who I was, and then also getting these graduate degrees, I decided I wanted to translate through the whole Gospel of Mark. I'd started it in one of my classes, and I decided I want to translate the whole thing and just write out my own translation and even memorize my own translation. So I began studying and memorizing my own translation of the Gospel of Mark. And when I got to the word disciple, I had to spend some time thinking through this word and unpacking its root meaning, looking it up in the lexicons, and seeing how it's used in the Gospels and throughout the Gospel of Mark. And here's where I want to get to the audience. So this is a little audience participation moment here. So perk up your ears, turn on your videos, get your chat fingers ready. The Bible uses a lot of words that sound very religious, and that we tend to only use in religious settings. Disciple, I would say, is one of those. We can sometimes use the word disciple to mean the follower of some philosopher or something, but it's not a very common word that we would use in everyday speech, other than when we're talking about Christianity for the most part. So here's my question to the audience, just out of curiosity: what other words can you think of, particularly Bible words, that we tend to only use in religious settings? So go ahead and you can throw it into the chat if you want, or just unmute yourself and throw that out. Any words that come to mind that are like, oh yeah, that's a religious word. I know that word, and I know it in the religious context. All right, so I'm seeing here blessed, sanctification. That's one that I had written down. Very good. Righteousness, excellent, right? So we don't tend to use the word righteous, outside of our religious context. Certainly not sanctification. Redemption, there are places where we could imagine using that, maybe in a court of law or something like that, but certainly that has a very deep religious meaning for us. Baptism, certainly, and baptism, as we'll see in a second, is not unlike this word disciple in some ways, in terms of the way that we use it. Yeah, holiness, good, these are good. And you can keep those coming if you want. What I discovered was disciple was kind of like that too. That disciple at its root actually has a really basic meaning, a meaning that you're probably already familiar with. I imagine I'm not going to teach you something that you don't know here to some degree, but one that that has made a tremendous difference for me in discovering and in kind of figuring out why we use this word the way that we use it, and really kind of why we use a lot of the words the ways that we use them. In Greek, the Greek word for disciple is mathetes, a word maybe you've heard before. It comes from a Greek verb manthano. Manthano just means to learn. And mathetes just means somebody who does the manthanoing, right? So a learner, essentially. And they're etymologically related to each other. Now, our word disciple doesn't sound anything like those 2 words, right? It doesn't sound like mathetes, doesn't sound like manthano. And that's because eventually the Greek Bible gets translated into Latin. And in Latin, the word for learning, and this will be fun for you, is disco. So if you take nothing else from this lesson, you've now learned that disco means to learn. So
Who
there
knew?
you go. Who knew? And now it's going to come around home, right? The word for a learner, right, or a student in Latin is a discipulis, right? Someone who discos, right? Someone who learns. and it's from Latin. And Latin became so prevalent in the Western church that when English speakers went to go translate the Bible into English, they had already been influenced by the way that Latin used the word. And so rather than translate this word as at least one way that we could have translated it would have been learner or student or something like that, we transliterate the word and we come up with this word disciple. And I think we've done ourselves a great disservice, unfortunately. Maybe not initially, maybe people knew what disciple meant initially, but now we've turned it into this kind of super religious word. Well, I'm a disciple, and everybody knows, ooh, a disciple. You're talking religious speak again. When disciple could have just meant, right, we could have just translated it as a learner, a student, somebody who follows Jesus and who's a pupil of Jesus, who sits at his feet to understand his teaching. And when it's a fairly simple point, I suppose, but when I came across that in my study as I was translating the Gospel of Mark, it just kind of opened the door for me to redefine what it was that I was doing when I was doing discipleship, in a sense. It changed the approach for me, right? So I had approached discipleship and being a disciple as a status. And that's what I had inherited, in a sense, from the ICOC. And we had even a phrase, right? Disciple equals saved, essentially, right? If you're a disciple, that you are saved, that you are a Christian, and that's what you are. And disciple kind of meant you're either in or you're out. It really means a learner. Then it's somebody who's committed to growth. And I want to point this out. Is there still a status component to it? Yes, obviously there is, right? You're either a follower of Jesus or you're not. That's still true. So don't hear me saying that, that it's all about the journey or something like that, right? That's not what I'm saying. But at the same time, it's not nearly as static as I had imagined it to be, right? To be a disciple is dynamic. To call yourself a learner implies that you are learning, implies that there's this ongoing student status, that you're continuing to study. And then the second lesson, and I'll make this one short, as I studied through the Gospel of Mark, the other thing that I discovered that really struck me and has continued to strike me, that's peculiar, I might say, about Jesus's teaching, and Mark especially highlights it. Matthew and Luke do it as well, but Mark makes a really big deal out of this, that Jesus loved parables. And he loved speaking in parables, so much so that Mark says in Mark 4, he basically taught nothing except by parables. Right? That's how Jesus taught. Now, clearly Jesus said other things and not just parables, and we have other examples of that. But Jesus loved to speak in parables. And then in Mark 4, the disciples eventually they get fed up and they say, Jesus, why do you say everything in parables? We don't understand what you're saying. And Jesus has this kind of enigmatic reply, right? And he says, I speak in parables, and he quotes Isaiah 6, and he says, so that they can be ever seeing but never perceiving, ever hearing but never understanding. In other words, there's this kind of layer on what Jesus says, where he is inviting additional work on the part of the listener, right? You hear it, but you don't understand it unless you work for it. And there's this running motif in the Gospel of Mark and in all of the Gospels, I think, of this revealing and concealing at the same time, that Jesus is both revealing exactly who he is, but it's only for those who have ears to hear who really understand who he is. It's only for those who have eyes to see who really see who he is. And that's what the parables do. They sift the hearts. And I realized what kind of teacher was as I began to study this out, that Jesus is the kind of teacher whose best lessons are for the students who stay after class, right? So he does this lesson, and then it's the students who stick around and say, Jesus, what did you mean by that? Jesus, what do you think about this? Jesus, wait, are you saying we should go here? Are you saying that it's these people who are in and not these people? Did you mean this when you said that? Right? It's all these students who stay after that Jesus is kind of attracting to him by talking in these parables, because he could have been very straightforward, right? He could have just said ABC, there it is, good and done, check it off and you can go forward. But he doesn't do that. And so the parables, from my point of view, they tickle the mind. They're like brain teasers. and they invite you in. They invite you to kind of take on a learner status, you might say, with Jesus. And so that's what Jesus does. That's how he teaches. He attracts lifelong learners. In other words, disciples. And that's what shifted for me in that kind of 10-year period
So
of
the
going,
disciples are the kids who stay after class?
basically,
Okay.
right? That's how you get an A in my class. You stay after and you ask more questions. Yeah, the disciples are the kids who stay after class.
Hmm.
And so that's what shifted for me in that 10-year period, right? Was kind of this understanding this dynamic that a disciple is somebody, and this is what I said to the interviewer that day, a disciple is somebody who has made a lifelong commitment to Jesus. And I used to think that meant that somebody who understood everything that they were doing the moment that they were converted and they had everything kind of right and ready to go. And I came to realize, right, that just can't be. It's not a bad idea. It's a great idea. It's just impossible, right? You can't possibly understand everything that your discipleship commits you to when you become a disciple of Jesus. But what you can understand is that you're making a commitment, to follow the life and teachings of Jesus. And that at its essence for me is what discipleship is and what discipleship became. And so the commitment there implies this ongoing journey that if I could leave you with this last image, that you're here on a student visa in God's kingdom, in the kingdom of God, right? So this is how you travel along on your student visa, going on this journey. And so you recognize that you don't understand it all, but you're committed to understanding. You're committed to learning. And that's my movement, I would say, in discipleship over the last 20 years now, but in that 10-year period or so. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Jeff and let you
Well,
kind of
Nick, yeah,
follow up.
let me ask you a couple questions, and please again use the chat line. I see somebody had to go that said I can't stay after class, but I'm still a good disciple. Thank you, Nick. um, when I think about what I experienced in rubbing up against the folks within the discipling movement and becoming friends, I remember feeling that there was more than I understood, because my understanding was you get it right, you go to church. And the discipling movement kind of cracked my taco and said, whoa, 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 whoa. One, how are you growing in your relationship with God? And how are you intensely, and boy, here's an old school phrase, total commitment. You know, the difference in I go to church and I am totally committed. Um, Tell me, Nick, if you would, how that may be something that, I mean, I continue to struggle with. How do we regain that without putting back in strictures of, okay, here's the list for what total commitment is and what, you know, true discipleship life change is?
I appreciate you bringing that phrase in, Jeff, because there's an irony there that I'm not so far from where I started, right? That if you were to describe what discipleship was in the ICOC in the late 90s, right? Then yeah, the word commitment would certainly have come up, and here I am using the word commitment again
Right.
some 20 years later. And so someone could easily say, well, then what's different? What, like you're still using the same word. And I think you're right. For me, what has shifted, or I'll say it this way, perhaps, my shift to embrace the lifelong learning aspect of discipleship versus the status aspect of discipleship has been freeing, because I don't need to worry the way that I think I often worried as a younger disciple. I worried, do I have it all right? Am I on the right path? What if I have this thing wrong? Will I not be right before God when God meets me one day? Right? And I had a checklist that I felt guilty about not checking off on a daily basis. And although I still use the same word, commitment now means for me that I am on the path in which I can trust that if I don't have something right, I will figure it out. And
Mm,
God has the grace to make allowances for that.
mm,
That here I am some 20 odd years later, and I'm still on this path, which means I must have made some kind of commitment. Right? I must still be in this journey following Jesus, because I'm still here asking these questions. I'm still here pursuing what it is to be a follower of Jesus. And so I don't need to worry to the degree that I think I worried as an early Christian about whether I was getting each component individually right, or what precisely I needed to have understood at the moment of my conversion to make my conversion effective in
mm,
some way. Those
mm.
were big things that worried me in an earlier time, and they worry me much less now with this different way of approaching discipleship.
Well, let me add a couple more words and get you to respond to these. There was a sense of, and continues to be, a sense of passion and dynamism in the spirit and the outreach of members of the International Churches of Christ. And I mean, from being in a worship assembly to gathering with the AO Waves here at Pepperdine, I mean, it is. I don't think it's unfair to say it's palpable, and somehow I believe it's wed to this concept of, man, I am a disciple. This is, I struggle with the language. This is serious business. We got to get after this. There's energy and pressure. And sometimes I walk into a congregation of the churches of Christ, or maybe even independent Christian churches, and it's like, wow, where is that? I don't know if it's a fresh, I just found this spirit. Can you speak to that, Nick? What have you learned looking across that, and how maybe are some practical ways that we can renew in that way about discipleship?
Yeah, Jeff, you're highlighting something that I think is one of the most attractive features
Mm,
about the community that the ICOC is so good at forming,
yeah.
right? So you're right. And the ICOC engenders that enthusiasm in people. And it's contagious. You go there and you feel like, I am part of something. I'm part of something big. I'm part of something important. We're in this together. And I'll be quite honest, right? And this is I don't know, I don't know what the right word is, right? And not an accusation, but this is a pushback on the community in which I am now worship. And you've just said it yourself, right? That's something that you don't often find in a Church of Christ setting, right? At least in kind of the
Yeah.
typical churches of Christ that I have been a part of, I can say it that way, right? Now there are pluses and minuses of that, obviously, and that's part of what the history of the ICOC was, right? So to what degree is it hype, and to what degree is it superficial, and to what degree is it deeply rooted? And I think that was one of the ways in which the ICOC discovered that it needed to reevaluate in the
Yeah.
early
And,
2000s
let,
was,
and let me
okay,
let me add another word that Mike Soto here has asked about, and that's
yeah,
mentorship. I wonder if some of that dynamism and energy also is translated in, I want I want to sound like, be like, if you will, some of the leaders. I know you got 2 minutes, and then you got to head off to class. So you got 2 minutes to talk about mentorship and your thoughts on that. Go for it.
the beauty of the ICOC was that it called each individual member to to a full commitment of what it is to be a follower of Jesus, right? The danger of the ICOC was that it called each individual member to a full commitment of what it was to be a follower of Jesus, and let that one story be the only story, right?
Mm,
Let the definition at the top, in a sense, of what it meant to be a disciple be the only definition of what it meant to be a disciple.
mm,
The honestly, the work that I do, and this is probably a fitting place for at least me to wrap it up, and I know you all will be able to continue there without me. Um, the the draw of the work that I'm doing now, between almost working as a liaison, you might say, between the ICOC and the Churches of Christ, and even the Christian churches, and I do some work with a group called Common Grounds, which is working very hard, and you've been a part of it, Jeff, and I imagine others on this call are familiar with it, of building bonds between these various streams of the Stone Camel movement to help us appreciate what we still have in common. The work that has been so attractive to me is realizing there are ways in which we need each other, right? So the ICOC had this youthful energy to it, which you have recognized, which still exists to some degree, that in many ways was absent and has been absent in the Churches of Christ over the last several decades, you might say. Although the Church of Christ, I think, had it at one point. It was also a campus-driven, movement, campus ministry-driven movement. The ICOC, on the other hand, I would say, in some ways, because of that very kind of campus-driven situation, lacked some of the maturity that the Churches of Christ had, some of the kind of deep Bible study, even that we've already talked about to some degree. And so wedding the two in a way, right, allowing them to come together is the perfect combination of the maturity of one and the wisdom, right, and the energy and the zeal of the other, and allowing them to complement each other and make up what the other lacks. And so that's been the most rewarding part of some of the work that I've been able to do lately, is help each side kind of see what we missed out by not letting these movements come and stay together and be a renewal movement from within, but having pushed one out in a sense. And only now are we beginning to realize we can do this together, that we're on the same team still here. And so that's where I would leave you in terms of the larger lessons that I have come to in my movements of discipleship.